Millions of convictions could be wiped from the police and national computer or kept hidden from employers to give minor criminals a second chance in life. Home Secretary Alan Johnson has announced a major review of the way police store details of criminal convictions for less serious offences, such as theft or criminal damage, which at the moment can be retained for 100 years. 100 years. Well, let's talk to John Thornhill, Chairman of the Magistrates Association. Good evening to you, John Thornhill.
Good evening.
Could you just explain, before we get into debate, what happens at the moment? I said there that your details can be retained for 100 years, but after 7 years, it's kind of no longer active on your criminal record, is it?
That's right. It's the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. And for most of the offences that we would deal with in the magistrates' course, after 7 years, that offence is not active. So therefore, when considering an individual's record, we would take that into account. So an offence which, say a minor motoring offence 7 or 8 years ago, and we're dealing with an offender who has committed a fraud or a theft, we probably wouldn't set any store by that previous record, that previous offence, because it's a dissimilar offence and it is 7 or 8 years ago, it's effectively spent.
Now that sounds like a grey area. You say you probably won't put any store by that. So it's spent after 7 years, but it's still there. So when considering sentencing, you're still aware of it, aren't you?
Yes, it's still there. It would be put before the bench on the defendant's record.
Why?
Because it's believed that that's information the bench ought to have in making a decision on sentence. For instance, if we have a set of records where we have 2 or 3 offences of theft in a position of trust, for instance, and we're dealing with someone who is again in a position of trust and has again stolen, that shows a propensity for that sort of offence. If, of course, it's an unlike offence, as I say, prior to 7 years ago, we probably wouldn't take it into consideration.
No, you see, but that's the problem with this, isn't it? It's not really spent, is it? Because you're saying you probably wouldn't take it into consideration. So even when a criminal conviction is spent after 7 years, no longer active, it could still be taken into consideration. It's not like having your points wiped off your licence, is it?
No, in that sense you're right. It's not like having your points wiped off your licence. But the issue is that in every single offence, with every single offender, we have to consider each case individually on its own merits. So I can't say we would not take it into account. It may be that it is relevant to the particular offence we're dealing with at that time.
Can I ask you about this as well? Certain employers are allowed to do criminal record checks, aren't they?
Yes.
With the Criminal Records Bureau, is that right? After 7 years, will they see old crimes or not?
I'm not sure about that one. That's one you'd have to check. There is a difference here between the record being put into a court for sentence when an offender's committed a further offence, and that record being seen when someone's applying for a job or applying for university, for instance. And I think there's a very important difference there.
There is an important difference, but it's an important question if employers can see spent crimes, spent convictions. Let me ask Chris Bath, my other guest. He's Director of Projects with the charity Unlock, which campaigns for people with previous convictions. Hello, Chris Bath. Chris, can you hear me?
Yep, no problem at all.
Yeah, do you know the answer to that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've alluded to the Rehabilitation Offenders Act already, and as John's pointed out, in terms of what magistrates would see, would go up to sort of small-scale prison sentences, and therefore 7 years would be the maximum period for disclosure. And that then goes up to longer prison sentences, being 10 years, and then if anyone actually is sentenced to a prison sentence over 2.5 years, so 30 months, they never ever get spent. Now, in your question about employers, yes, it is different, and I think we would ourselves discriminate between information that's relevant for a magistrate to have and information that's relevant for an employer to have. And indeed, the point of the Rehabilitation Offenders Act is once that conviction is spent, it's not disclosable for employment purposes, unless, of course, you're working with children or vulnerable adults. There are special dispensations there. So there is a big difference between what information gets past the judiciary and information that would go to an employer.
That's interesting. And when sometimes in certain countries, when you travel abroad or you try and get a visa, let's say to go to America, they will ask you if you have a criminal conviction, and that can impact on whether you're allowed to go, whether you get a visa. After 7 years, can they still see that, or is that spent? Is that excluded from them?
You know, we have a online discussion forum as part of our charity. We have about 4,000 members who are reformed offenders, and probably the first issue that's discussed on there, the most popular issue, is discrimination in employment, which kind of is central to what you're talking about here. But the second one, and a really big growing one, is international travel. And there is no link necessarily between what the UK decides is spent and unspent and what other countries do. So we have lots of backwards and forths trying to work out whether I sold a chocolate biscuit 30 years ago in the UK, will I be able to get into the US? And it's actually a complete minefield, and many people don't get to leave those things behind.
Well, that's fascinating, isn't it? So it's not that black and white at all. You see, the reason I keep asking these points is because I think a lot of people will imagine that after 7 years, I think previously to hearing this, or people who thought that it was like your driving licence, that after 7 years it's wiped altogether. So in certain circumstances, it's quite possible for, say, the US Embassy to see that you have a criminal conviction from 20 years ago, even though it's long spent. They could still see that.
Well, it's not that they see it. It's that when you're the UK citizens are currently come under a visa waiver program for the US. But if you've been convicted of a criminal offence at any point, or caution even, you then have to disclose that to the US authorities. You could choose to not disclose that, but of course you're then entering the country illegally, and you could be arrested and deported, which is obviously not something you'd want to do if you've changed your life around and you're an upstanding.
But even the principle of being asked that does seem to be at odds with the idea of a crime being spent, a conviction being spent after 7 years. Let's go back to John Thornhill, Chairman of the Magistrates Association. So, Alan Johnson, we're talking about this because the Home Secretary has announced a major review of the way police store the details of criminal convictions, and at the moment, for now, they can be retained for 100 years. John Thornhill,
that's right.
What is the point of that?
It probably goes back into history. There is really no point in that, obviously. What is important is, if somebody comes before a court, then if there is relevant information about their previous criminal history, then that should be put before the court, and the magistrate allowed to decide how they use that particular piece of information. So, for instance, if you have someone who has brought before you for shoplifting, and they have previous records for shoplifting extending back a fairly long period of time, we know there's a problem there. And so we may want to say, well, in this case, we're going to try and deal with this. But
I don't think that's what Alan Johnson is talking about. If you have a pattern of behaviour, and if you have shoplifted many times over several years, then anyone, I'm sure, can understand that argument, an argument for keeping those details on record because of that pattern. But I think what the Home Secretary is talking about is people who have just committed a one-off, relatively minor crime. Would you agree with Chris Bath, our other guest, that one-off minor crimes should be wiped completely from the police national computer after a relatively small amount of time?
I wouldn't agree that they should be wiped completely from the computer, but I would agree...
Well, they will haunt people.
I would agree that they should be used in a measured and balanced way. I think that's the important issue.
Why not get rid of them? You could be someone who made as a teenager just a minor, regrettable, silly transgression could potentially, like Paul we heard from earlier, that wasn't his real name, it can haunt them forever.
Well, what message are we sending? We're sending out a message which says you can commit these offences and that will be the end of it.
Yes.
We have a problem at the moment with 55% of all offenders never come to court, with these out-of-court disposals that the police are using. And
that's a different matter, isn't it? Well, I guess what the argument that goes, that if you nick a pencil as a 17-year-old and get convicted for it, if it's not wiped from the police national computer, you might never get a job as a teacher, ever. Because you nicked a pencil as a 16-year-old.
I think that is where I'm saying that information should be used in a balanced and measured way.
But it should be kept, is what you're saying.
I'm saying it should be kept because it is important that it's kept for court purposes. If that person offends again, then that information is part of the information upon which magistrate would sentence that individual.
Okay.
I can agree with the argument that, someone who commits a very minor offence, although they've still committed a criminal offence, right, that it should be effectively spent if after a period of time, 7 years for instance, no further offences are committed. And I could accept that there is an argument which says that should not prevent them from getting a proper employment.
I'm going to move on from this, I'm afraid. But Chris Bath, back to you, your reaction.
Yeah, I mean, what Alan Johnson's talking about is children It's talking about minor convictions. One of the cases actually was about someone who stole a 99p packet of meat in 1984 and was fined 15 quid.
Yes.
What we've got in terms of bureaucracy is 8 million people on a government database who've been convicted of things before. We've got evidence of illegal CRB checks. We've got the introduction of the Independent Safeguarding Authority. Now, John might well use this information in the measured and balanced ways, but there are other more sort of shadowy, sort of bureaucratic processes being put in place by the government that mean millions of people might actually be judged by people who aren't trained magistrates in terms of whether they get the chance to work or not.
I would agree with the point Chris is making. What I'm saying is what we shouldn't do is throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. What we need to do is keep the information, but ensure that we use it in a proper manner, and that only those who should have access to it, such as the judiciary, do have access to it, and it should not be used to prevent young people, once they've got a bit older, gaining employment.
All right, John Thornhill and Chris Bath.